Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into something fundamental for pretty much any organization out there. We're talking about the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, COSO, and specifically their Enterprise Risk Management Framework, or ERM. Our goal here, our mission, if you like, is to unpack this guidance. It's hugely influential, even though it's not actually mandatory. Think of it as a way for organizations to get a better handle on internal control, risk management, governance, and even fraud deterrence. We want to explore how it really works in practice.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is where it came from. It wasn't just dreamed up in a vacuum. It really emerged from, some pretty major corporate scandals we saw in the past, times when you could see a clear lack of good risk management. The regulations that followed those scandals sort of cried out for clearer guidance, and COSO really stepped in to provide those best practices.
And it's definitely not static. COSO's approach has changed quite a bit over the years. It started with an initial pyramid model, then moved to the COSO Cube, which most people recognize. And there have been even more recent updates too. It keeps evolving. So maybe let's rewind a little. COSO itself, that started back in the mid-'80s, right? And first job was quite specific, wasn't it? Researching fraudulent financial reporting.
That's right. Tells you something about the problems they were trying to tackle from the get-go. And from that specific start, the ERM model grew. The first one, 1992, the pyramid. That was really about looking at the controls you already had. But then 2013, that was the big shift, the introduction of the COSO Cube. That changed the game, really. The focus moved squarely onto the design and implementation of a whole risk management framework. And that cube, it just took off, became widely accepted, very adaptable.
Yeah, the cube. You see diagrams of it everywhere. And it makes sense why it's popular. It connects three really key things that often get looked at separately. So on the top, you've got the organization's objectives. What are we trying to achieve? Then the front face shows those 8 essential components needed to get there, the building blocks. And the third dimension, the side, represents the different parts of the organization, showing you can apply it to a division, a specific unit, or the whole company. Forces that holistic view.
And like you said, it didn't stop there. That 2013 framework got an update in 2017. The name actually changed slightly. Enterprise Risk Management integrating with strategy and performance. And the visual changed too, more like a helix, trying to show that ongoing dynamic nature of risk. But honestly, despite the updates, that COSO Cube structure, it's still incredibly useful as a mental model for understanding risk management. That's why we still talk about it so much.
Absolutely. And COSO staying current, isn't it? They're not just sitting back. They put out some really important stuff recently. Guidance on cyber risks in, 2019?
Yeah, and then blockchain and internal control in 2020.
Right. And ERM for cloud computing in 2021. They're definitely tackling the big emerging issues head on. Okay, so that's the background. Let's pivot now and really dig into those 8 components on the front of the cube. These are the practical things organizations need to get right and, frankly, where a lot of the challenges lie.
Okay, first up, the internal environment. This isn't just about written rules. It's more like the culture, the atmosphere of the organization. It sets the tone, influences risk appetite, ethical values, how people generally feel about managing risk. It's the bedrock.
And that tone ultimately has to come from the top, from the board. I mean, if the board isn't balanced, lacks the right knowledge or experience or diversity or strong independent voices, it just undermines everything. That's why things like audit committees, risk committees, they're so critical for that oversight piece.
Exactly. And even if the board sets a great example, it can still unravel further down. If line managers let staff ignore controls, maybe, or if there's just this relentless pressure for results, no matter the risk, that good tone from the top can just disappear.
Which actually brings up a key criticism you sometimes hear about the ERM model. Some argue it's a bit too inward-looking, starting with the internal environment. The argument is, does it adequately reflect how much things like the competitive landscape, regulations, external pressures, how much they really shape risk appetite and culture? What are your thoughts?
That's a fair challenge. It is easy to get too focused internally. But moving on to the second component, objective setting, the board's role is crucial again here. Objectives need to clearly support the mission, obviously, but they also have to align with the risk appetite. And that means understanding the risks that come with pursuing certain goals, those entrepreneurial risks from big investments or trying to outmaneuver competitors.
And this is where that distinction between risk appetite and risk tolerance becomes important. People mix them up, but appetite is the broad level of risk the organization is willing to take on.
Right.
Whereas tolerance is more about the acceptable deviation from a specific objective. Getting those aligned across the business is, tricky.
And it's interesting how even something like a code of ethics fits in here. It's not just about compliance. It can be a strategic move, positioning the company as socially responsible, for instance. That can attract talent, customers.
So it's a control, but also potentially a competitive advantage.
Exactly.
But we also need the cautionary tales, right? Think about Enron. Their whole complex structure, their deliberately confusing business model, it was basically designed to hide objectives that were, frankly, illegal or unethical. It shows that the framework itself can't fix fundamentally bad intentions.
A stark reminder. Okay, Component 3, event identification. This is about systematically looking for things, internal or external, that could impact your objectives. And COSO makes this key distinction. Negative events are risks.
The bad stuff.
But positive events are opportunities. And those opportunities should ideally loop back into your strategy setting.
Sounds simple, but this is a real stumbling block for some. You see these cultures where it's like, nothing ever goes wrong here, so they don't even look for potential events. And there's that criticism, again, sometimes focusing too much on internal operational stuff, maybe missing the big strategic threats coming from outside.
And it's not just about the big sudden shocks like a takeover bid or something. It's also about identifying those slower burns, gradual shifts in the market, or maybe changes in your own internal culture, things that creep up on you.
That's a point sometimes raised against the ERM framework, isn't it?
Yeah.
That it maybe overemphasizes these sudden events and doesn't focus enough on those slow cumulative changes.
It has been, yes. The slow changes can be just as damaging, sometimes more so, because they're harder to spot.
And whatever the event, if it's a danger sign, like say a product starting to fail, responding quickly is just paramount. You need to minimize the damage to sales, reputation, everything.
Okay, next component, risk assessment. So you've identified potential events or risks. Now what? Now you assess them. How likely are they? What's the potential impact? This informs how you'll manage them. And crucially, you have to think about how different risks might connect or influence each other. Nothing happens in total isolation.
Right. And COSO suggests using a mix of methods here, qualitative, quantitative, and looking at both inherent risk, the risk before you do anything.
Your raw risk.
Yeah, and residual risk, what's left over after you've put controls or responses in place. You need to understand both levels.
But here's a potential trap. Sometimes the model can, perhaps, encourage a slightly oversimplified view, like thinking of a risk materializing as just one single outcome. It happens or it doesn't. But many risks, think about extreme weather or market volatility, they have a whole range of possible outcomes, from minor to catastrophic.
So the assessment needs to reflect that range, not just a single point estimate.
Ideally, yes. A more nuanced view of the potential spectrum of impact.
Which leads us neatly into risk response. Component 5. This is management deciding what to actually do about the assessed risks to get them within appetite and tolerance levels. Usually boils down to those 4 options: reduce it, accept it, transfer it, or avoid it altogether.
And the really critical thing COSO stresses here is taking a portfolio view. Don't just respond to risks one by one in silos. Think about the overall picture. How do the responses interact? Organizational level portfolio management, diversification, that's key. And responses have to be practical. You weigh the cost against the benefit, the impact, plus the environment matters. If you're in a highly regulated industry, your response options might be quite constrained. And for really serious risks like health and safety, you often encounter the ALAR principle.
As low as reasonably practicable.
Exactly. It means you have to keep reducing the risk until the cost of doing more is grossly disproportionate to the benefit. It's a strong obligation.
And this response stage is also where you design your internal controls. COSO talks about needing a mix, controls that prevent things, controls that detect things after they happen.
Manual controls, automated controls.
Right, building layers of defense, essentially.
Which brings us straight to component 6, control activities. These are the actual policies, the procedures, the actions taken to make sure those risk responses are carried out effectively. And COSO makes this point very clearly. Controls are affected by people. They aren't just manuals sitting on a shelf or automated system rules. People make them work or not work.
Yeah, the human factor. That's usually why controls fail, isn't it? Maybe staff don't take them seriously, or they just make honest mistakes.
Or collusion happens, 2 or more people working together to bypass a control.
And the big one, management override. When leadership just decides to ignore the rules for some reason.
Exactly, and that's precisely why COSO puts such emphasis on things like segregation of duties. It's a fundamental control. Makes it harder for one person to commit fraud undetected and increases the chances that errors get caught by someone else. It's basic but powerful.
And these controls, they need to be everywhere, right? Not just in finance, across all levels of the organization, at different points in business processes, and definitely covering the IT environment today, end to end.
Okay, number 7, information and communication. This basically says your information systems need to capture the right data and get it to the right people at the right time in the right format so that people can actually do their jobs, including their risk management responsibilities. And the information needs to be relevant, good quality, and cover all the objectives we talked about way back at the beginning.
And it's not just about the data systems. It's about actually communicating with staff, making sure people understand the risks relevant to their roles. That's how you embed risk awareness into the culture, make it part of daily work.
Definitely. And if this breaks down, well, you can get some bad outcomes. Maybe senior managers don't demand the information they should be getting from a unit that looks like it's doing well on the surface.
Complacency setting in.
Or perhaps operational managers tend to downplay bad news when they're reporting upwards, especially if it's reporting by exception. Problems might not surface until they're much bigger.
Right. Okay, brings us to the final component, number 8, monitoring. The whole system, the whole ERM framework implementation needs to be watched, checked, and adjusted continuously. Guidance on how best to do this monitoring has also evolved quite a bit.
Yeah, for example, at the board level, the Turnbull guidance that came out in the UK was quite significant. It really put the onus on boards to formally review their risk management systems regularly, including an annual assessment. Made it explicit. And when you talk about monitoring through separate evaluations, who are the key players? Usually the audit committee and the internal audit function.
Which kind of leads to a fundamental question maybe for you, our listener, to ponder.
Yeah.
As an organization gets bigger, more complex, is effective monitoring even possible without a dedicated, independent internal audit department?
It gets increasingly difficult to argue that it is, doesn't it? That independent check becomes pretty vital.
So wrapping this up, it's pretty clear COSO's ERM model, especially visualized by that cube, has given organizations a really solid, adaptable structure, a foundation for managing risk more effectively, building that resilience we all need.
Absolutely. But maybe the crucial takeaway, linking back to those scandals that started it all, managers, leaders, everyone needs to be aware not just of the framework, but also its limits. Where can this process go wrong? Understanding those potential failure points is just as important as understanding the components themselves.
That's a great point. And it leaves us with maybe a final provocative thought for you to take away. We've seen COSO update its guidance for cyber, for cloud. So looking ahead, with technology and the global landscape changing so fast, what are the next big challenges? What unforeseen risks might future versions of the ERM framework need to grapple with? What could be the next major blind spot for organizations that this framework needs to help illuminate? Something to think about.